All right, today we'll look at 5.1, industrialization, and more specifically, global capitalism. Now, I do think that these two PowerPoints will go together, and there will be some points where you'll see a kind of a seamless transition from what Mr. Agnew did with industrialization and what I'm going to teach you about today with global capitalism. And 5.1 is dominated by these two concepts, so you have to know both of them in order to get a full picture here of what's going on. And what's going on really truly is oftentimes represented by what you see in this picture here to the left, where you have at the very, very top of this capitalistic pyramid is money, and then the people that are in control of that money, the people who look to influence that and protect that, and then the people who consume it, and then finally at the very, very bottom, the people that are actually making that money but not enjoying all of the fruits of that labor here. So this is going to be a concept that's going to be very important as we start moving forward into things like ethics and the other key concepts of time period 5. And it's going to start with, once again, that idea of industrialization changing the way in which goods are produced, which Mr. Agnew already discussed. Now, the upper class and lower classes have already been kind of solidified with their positions. The rich stay rich, the poor stay poor. There's a little bit of mobility in the center, flexibility back and forth as some, rare entrepreneurs like Carnegie and Rockefeller like that who have some kind of monopoly. There are some exceptions where they move up, but for the most part, factory workers are barely earning enough to kind of survive, and factory owners are becoming super wealthy as they are selling all of their goods. That idea that labor being an important source of generating this wealth, you need cheap labor. So that streets are paved with gold idea that immigrants are coming over for rarely happened in most cases to the point where originally thought or contended. Financial status and social status do undergo some small changes, but that's not going to be something that we see a massive overhaul with when it comes to this time period. And of course, we already talked about labor with women and children. That's going to be some issues for industrialization and the effects thereof when it comes to urbanization and the growth of the city. Different industries are fueling the growth of the American economy, and those industries for the most part are very dangerous or labor intensive, and so we do undersee some social changes that are happening there. Machinery, before we get to the actual globalizing factors here, machinery is the biggest reason why you're going to start seeing a massive explosion on a global scale. Technology and machines go right hand in hand with the factory system that was already discussed in the previous PowerPoint. So urbanization as a result of industrialization leads to more industrialization. That's the circle of business that was probably discussed earlier. And then you see this example with England with the first industrial revolution. When they are successful, of course, those ideas are going to be stolen by people that are connected to them, west of modern mainland Europe, west countries like America, for example, and then of course they spread that out. Things like the cotton gin, for example, take tools and challenges that have been happening in England and they improve upon those things over in places like the Americas. And then, of course, the factory itself is also going to, lead us to this globalization, because that whole system in general is going to be taken, modified, stolen, utilized, tweaked, improved upon, etc., etc. And increasing need in more industrializing powers to be places like America, Japan, China, mainland Europe. Those are all places that are going to see rapid population growth, and then of course increased global trade leads to more and more demand. You have a need versus demand system at this point when it comes to the factory, and when you have a need versus demand system and there's always more demand and need for a good or a production or a technology, that's what's going to lead us to global capitalism, because now you have those markets being interchanged and interwoven amongst themselves. So, of course, the spread of the circle of business is going to take route in Great Britain first with the first Industrial Revolution. It's going to spread to its earliest, holdings, which are really the colonies overseas. And so look at British Imperial expansion. Whenever you see British Imperial expansion, that's where you're going to see the new wave of the global capitalistic mindset. So I have a couple examples there for you with Japan, the US, and Russia. Those incentives are there, the populations are there, the want and demand is there, therefore that's where it's heading. And then once you start adding some of those stolen ideas and concepts and technologies into these areas and businesses, then it's going to really start to take off and flourish during this time period for subsidiary places besides Great Britain. A couple more introduction slides here. Cities are not prepared for the population growth that's going to start taking place. So global capitalism has a profound effect on, urbanization and all that kind of stuff. The agricultural revolution in the 18th century is a super critical for this. Once again, we've made this clarification now at several points along the course. When you have more food, you can have more people, and when you have more people, those people have to live somewhere. And the growth of that is the cities. But unfortunately, they're not prepared. You played the urban game where you know what's going to happen when you start congesting these places. And so inadequate housing and water supplies, along with dwindling sewage and food supplies and lighting, will result in the growth of the slum, which is an issue for global capitalism that we'll have to deal with in many emerging marketplaces. And kind of we see this today building forward. You know that there are first world countries and there are second and third world countries, and how you typically distinguish between them is look at their level of industrialization and the level of money and power, and then look at the low rates of success in some of the other places, and that's where you get your breakdowns at some level. And here's what we're talking about as far as that sweet spot of the Industrial Revolution. You can see that Western Europe is king of the mountain at some point, especially when China starts to go into their self-strengthening movements and all that kind of stuff. They're going to start waning in their GDP percentage, their output. Western Europe will continue to rise. And look at America, and in the dark blue there, you're going to start seeing their growth kind of on a similar track as the Western Europeans, and then of course after World War I, which is the end of the time period and kind of bracketed by the edge of this box here to the right, that's when America really starts to pull ahead of everybody else, eventually even dwarfing that of Western Europe, and then it kind of ebbs and flows with Western Europe. So we're on our rise here as far as our power here based on profit and production. So then looking at Roman numeral 2 here of 5.1, you got new patterns of global trade. So the raw materials that are being produced, you've got some new additions here that are going to be important because they're going to add to the overall conversation here with exportation. And so coal and iron and cotton and food and labor and wood, some of those are some of the old guard, so to speak, and some of them are the new guard, and those things are going to lead us to overall world trade being increased. And once again, it's all about marketplaces being created. So when places like England have colonies overseas, those colonies overseas are new markets, and then those local markets demand goods, and so we have to increase production to meet those demands. And then all of a sudden you have more and more influx of raw materials, widespread. Technologies make that transportation and travel quicker, and the rest, as they say, is history. Overall global trade has increased, and even today, if you order something from overseas, it can be to your house within a few days, more than likely. If you order something within the country, it can be there the next day or the day after. There's a very quick turnaround here, and that increase in production, that increase in transportation is what allows this global capitalism to really take form, because railroads and canals and steamships and interchangeable parts when it comes to boating and other technologies really increases travel distance and decreases travel time. So as a result, you've got different economic interests being increased, and then you've got different economic interest declining. So I left you with a question here as far as, as industrial production rose, what type of production declined? And you should be able to think about different productions that we've had up to this point, and they're declining. So really, truly, it's agriculture. You've increased the amount of spread of different goods due to the Columbian Exchange and products, and so now you have, cash crops per se, and you'll see some of those things really be a major cornerstone of this, type of discussion. Sugar, palm oil, rubber, cotton, once again, coal, steel, those kinds of things being added to this conversation. Agricultural production starts to go down, although it is not going down with, effectiveness. It's really just going down with production amount. We're still making plenty of food to feed the world. And C looks at that increase in productivity and that immersion of new markets. And so what does that look like? It looks like, unfortunately, that we're going to start exploiting easily exploitable natives. And so places that we think in the West that we can go to and kind of make our own, we're going to start doing that. And a big, thing with this is our use of trade goods like manufactured goods, guns, and other products, sugar, steel, all that kind of stuff we just mentioned in the last slide. We're going to start monopolizing those products, and we're going to start wanting to trade them for other goods. So, in a way here, this is when you start seeing the opening up of other exploitable powers to be. And the main example that AP likes to talk about is China, the opening up, quote unquote, of China by places like France and Britain, as personified by this very famous political cartoon where China as a pie or a pizza being carefully, carved up by other powers. And you've got in this picture, Great Britain, you've got Russia, you've got France, you've got Germany, you've got Japan there sitting down. So all five of those powers eventually take their swing at China to get to those trade goods. That GDP chart I showed you at the very beginning of this time period, this Industrial Revolution, China is producing tons and tons of wealth. And so now it's time for them to start giving up that wealth to the West, because we are now the bigger players in the game. And D looks at the need for specialized metals and limiting metals. So iron becomes essential for stuff like steel. Coal becomes essential for stuff like production. Silver and gold and copper are going to be exploited for their use in transit and things like the railroad, stuff like that. All that leads to increasing in exports. And then, of course, gold and silver still are super important. We are using them more and more to back up paper money and go on what is called the gold standard in many cases. And so that's going to be something that we have to keep an eye on, because that flow of that material has to keep coming in from somewhere. And copper, as another demonstrative thing like that, opening up for global capitalism, we're going to go to new avenues and new places for those precious metals. So the example that the AP likes to make sure that you know is that in Mexico, there are a lot of copper mines that we're needing for that. South Africa is a new zone for diamonds and gold, and slaves at the very onset of this are still a viable product as well, although towards the middle of this time period that is quickly going to change, and you should already know about that. Civil War, 1840s, 1860s. There are other countries that are right around that time period as well that start to banish and abolish slavery, and so that process is ongoing. Roman numeral 3 looks at the investments that are being made in production, and then, of course, what happens because of that. People that are doing investing are going to be, getting really, really super wealthy in many cases. Banks have to loan money to people that want to start a business, because that's how they're going to make their money back, and they pay on it, which is how any loan works. Governments are funding different developments, and railroads and canals are the great example of that. They're infrastructure, right? Governments usually fund or aid in some way infrastructure, and so that's all going to help serve them as well, because they're going to make more tax revenue off of those goods that are being moved along those routes. Then you start seeing the rise of big business and what we call trusts. And the easiest way to describe trusts is that very next line there, monopolies. Trusts are, in a way, very large businesses that end up having, in many cases, monopolies over certain products or businesses or stuff like that. And so you start seeing business grow on a national scale. And at some point in the later slides and in later parts of history, we are turning those national scale businesses into international or transnational businesses, where we're going to be spanning many water sources or land sources. At the end of the day, money concentrating with the super rich. Once again, you've all played Monopoly. That's the whole point. You want to control everything and then wipe out your other fellow players. And this leads to a very important dilemma as to, why is that process, this ongoing process, the way it needs to be, right? What was wrong with the way we were doing it in the past, where kind of everybody had a little piece of the pie and we don't have to have monopolies? Well, as we start to look at that, you've got different inspirations for these changes lying in the development of capitalism. And really those are associated with a couple of different people, such as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. And so industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller and other people that are making tons of money often are trying to legitimize their changes that they've been making in order to make more money. And here are 3 examples of that for you. The first is social Darwinism, which can basically be explained with that little visual that I have for you there at the bottom. Some people are better suited to be handling money and stuff like that, so it's their job to kind of make sure that they're taking care of the people. The people don't have that same ability, so the people are supposed to be giving all of that to that. Darwin was a big person in evolution, so you can kind of see where we're going with that. Social evolution, the survival of the fittest, right? The survival of the fattest and the richest. It really should be what we kind of consider that nowadays. Then you have the gospel of wealth, which was a religious aspect here where, gospel, think of, Christianity and the Bible and stuff like that, the gospels. Basically, industrialists sometimes are saying that they have been given a strict duty to help the poor by providing them with opportunities like jobs and that kind of good stuff. Not necessarily charity per se where you're giving away things, but they're supposed to be giving the poor opportunities because God has given them that privilege to do so. And then finally, the third way that we're using legitimate enterprises here are the self-strengthening movements. And you have a couple of examples that we're going to look at later on, like in places like China, where you have to maintain a kind of movement within a country as you're developing so that you can make it stronger. And so you're going to kind of take on this belief that the work that you do is going to be useful for developing the nation as a whole. So it's not just big business of, let's say, for example, cotton getting rich. That cotton will lead to other industries getting rich, which will lead to a stronger country. It's a self-strengthening movement, an internal movement to make yourself stronger from within, to make the whole body stronger. Like when you go to the gym, you work out your arms just to work out your arms. Your arms make you healthier overall. We see an expansion, therefore, of these financial institutions. And so we start introducing things like the stock market and insurance and the gold standard and limited liability corporations. Those are all extremely important financial instruments that are going to be expanding. Of course, you should know vaguely what a lot of these are already. Stock market's a place where you can trade openly shares of different companies. If you want to be a part of a company, you buy a share of it, right? And then, of course, the more shares you have, the more control and say you have on what that company does. And if that company makes money, you make money. If that company loses money, you lose money. To go along with that, you have insurance, right? You don't want to make a purchase or something and then all of a sudden, bam, it goes up and has an accident and you lose your whole entire investment. So you have insurance where you kind of split that risk per se with other investors or people. So for example, if your parents have car insurance and home insurance, which they more than likely do, the reason they pay a low rate if they're doing well is because they're sharing that risk of their house being set on fire or their car getting into an accident with all the other drivers and homeowners in their state or whatever. Then of course if you need it, it's there for you. The gold standard is, once again, that backup of paper money with gold. You had to have a certain amount of gold always in stock, which will lead us to, more and more gold being needed by these countries as they're growing. And then, of course, limited liability corporations that are being set up, just like the title implies, with limited liability. That way you have yourself covered. If you were to lose everything, you technically would not lose everything. There will be provisions that take care of you at some point. Think of early forms of being bankrupt, right? When you declare bankruptcy, you don't lose everything. You just kind of have to go through some difficult processes there initially. C on the same thing looks at being large-scale transnational businesses. We talked about that. Large national growth of businesses will sometimes move over into transnational or across nations. And the two best examples are the United Fruit Company in the West and the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation in the East. Both companies start local and then explode overseas and become extremely important in dealing in land holdings and money and profit in other respective countries. And then, of course, Roman numeral 4 is about major developments in transportation and communication, because that's what global capitalism is all about. If we can't move things on a global scale, then, we're just talking about regular local capitalism, and that's not what we're talking about. So you have a couple examples there that are important developments in this. We already talked about steam power and coal being used to power ships and trains on a more reliable scale, which is going to increase production on land and overseas. Then we talked about trains and railroads that enable certain products to move very quickly. Ideas are extremely important, and they're going to become very rapidly moving around. And that's going to be something that we look at with other ideals like the Enlightenment and all that kind of stuff. Canals, once again, on smaller waterways, and then the transportation is not just for goods and people, it's also for communication. And so now we have the telegraph being used. And right around the corner from now, we are going to be entering the information age, to which you are all a part of now, because obviously if you wanted to ever know something, you can, at the drop of a hat, at the click of a couple of buttons on your phone, find out that information more than likely. Couple more slides here. As we develop and spread global capitalism, there's a variety of responses to that spread. A talks about workers organizing themselves to stop being exploited. We've been exploiting the workers for quite some time, and so now you have to kind of look at what are the effects of that. And some of the effects are sometimes positive, some of the effects are sometimes negative. All together, we have some examples of workers accepting their status, like the people that are believing in, rags to riches type stories of some of those early entrepreneurs, and they're going to start trying to, kind of protect and protest, more importantly, unfair work practices. We talked about the Factory Act of 1800s there with how we have to do with hours and labor and all that kind of stuff. Well, workers' unions are being established here to try to, go against the monopolies that are crippling the workers' rights, yet making tons of money for the factory owners and stuff like that. And of course, governments establish antitrust organizations later to kind of deal with monopolies and kind of break them up. You had one example of this with, about 2 decades ago with one of the major, computer companies here in this country. This is when we also start introducing things like utopian socialism, Marxism, and anarchism as examples of what's coming out as a result of this exploitation. And all these things are in your textbook or in certain videos that we've watched or will watch all together. That last little, paragraph chunk there about governments responding to economic changes, sometimes that's very aggressive response, and sometimes it's very lackadaisical. So in the U.S., for example, we do ban slavery eventually, but big business, we do almost nothing to stop big business from being big business, which is part of the problem that some people have with politics today. It's because how does it get to that? Well, typically big business invests in political people and fund their campaigns, and then those people don't, stick it to them later on down the road. Japan takes on a different approach here. They become more and more involved with business. We're going to start seeing the change over here, especially during the Meiji Restoration. And then, of course, some people, I should say, develop massive armies because of that, which they're going to use to kind of start this process of becoming more and more powerful, which is going to eventually lead us to places like World War I and stuff in the continental Europe. And then finally, there's competition within these industrialized nations. And once again, when you develop more and more sizable armies and you have more and more sizable competition over production and wealth and blah, 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 we're setting up for a major conflict. And right after this time period, you will have the first of many major conflicts as a result of this development. two great examples in Part B that AP will expect you to know are about Qing China and the Ottoman Empire. And so, members of that, or I should say those governments, resist economic change and attempt to maintain pre-industrial forms of economic production. A view that industrialization is wrong, it's exploitive, it's incorrect with how it deals with social issues and gender and all that kind of good stuff. So let's just not do any of that. And that's incredibly important, because although it's threatening to them as they see it, eventually they have drastic changes that are occurring around them. And, if you have all those changes happening around you and everybody else around you is getting super, super wealthy and powerful, that's going to lead to issues within your own area. And in some small number of states, governments are promoting, as a result, their own state-sponsored visions of industrialization. And I provided you with 4 examples there of such examples. Economic reforms in Meiji Japan, which will be covered later. Factories and railroads being developed in Russia, which is now ever expanding. You have China's self-strengthening movement, which is talked about in your book and in some of your crash courses. And then finally in Northern Africa, in Egypt, the growing development within the textile industry and cotton. And this is really dominated by Muhammad Ali and his reforms that are being made to that industry. All of these are state-sponsored, so that's going to be very important as we start looking at what's important with governments. Hands-off approaches to industrialization, which is what America was doing per se, or hands-on approaches to industrialization, as is listed in these 4 examples for you. D, with reforms, obviously part of that whole response train of thought is we got to make certain reforms that are happening. If we're not going to change the way business is operating, you got to at least make it easier for the lower classes to survive. And so we start seeing things like pension and public health plans. Places like Germany are great for that early on in this time period. Expansion of voting rights in places like Great Britain. Public education in many states, that we start seeing all those things. Education starts being more and more of a public enterprise, not a private school type of system. And then, of course, the how and the why. There has to be some kind of go-between between big business and the lowly workers. And so unions are sometimes for that. Mediation is sometimes needed for that. Once again, as previously mentioned, the U.S. government at first did nothing but favor big business and growth. And then later, when things are so bad and things are so monopoly-ridden and so heavily dominated by a couple of big businesses, we have the development of anti-monopoly acts. Think of like the Sherman Antitrust Act. What do you do in monopoly when you get in trouble? You go to jail, right? So that's the same thing that happens with all these big businesses. But instead of going to jail per se, which obviously some of them did go to jail, the people that run them, you have the breakup of those industries to where they're not so monopolistic anymore. And then, of course, protesters that are occurring during this time period have to be dealt with as well. Sometimes that's very positive, sometimes that's very negative, and we have a history of that in this country, especially of breaking up protests in a violent way. And once again, that's not a good thing in many areas. China, once again, as a example here, because we always want to talk about an Eastern and Western example. They are different, I guess, motivated here. They're motivated differently. They want to self-strengthen, right? So they adopt Western technology. However, they don't want to become fully industrial like America, because they see that as being, problematic based on their values. And so they're in a really interesting juxtaposition where they want to make all the money, but they don't want to be, corrupted like they feel Western areas have been corrupted. That's a reaction to, the rise of Western dominance. They have to adapt, otherwise they're going to get swallowed up by these Western powers. But they don't want to move too fast to where they lose their identity culturally speaking. And I believe we have one more slide here. The ways in which people organize themselves into societies also underwent significant transformations in these states due to fundamental restructuring of the global economy. Overall, in industrialized nations, cities are the population centers. Initially, because once again you played your urban game, there's a huge rate of mortality and illness and unsanitary condition, and then In some cases, famine and food shortage is common, and so that's going to make this population dramatically decreased. But by the end, when we start making changes to this process and start increasing money and increasing investment by, all that kind of stuff, time of racial prejudice becoming more prominent is underlined by slow and moderate increases in sanitation and working conditions. Okay, so although we have that social Darwinism with race being more and more influential in how we deal with some of these people that are making up these working classes, we are inevitably making the working classes slowly come out of their bad conditions and slowly making things better. Is it a full change? Is it 180 degrees of prosperity? Absolutely not. In fact, workers in many industrialized countries, in some cases, still grapple with those issues. Look at America. We're not perfect. So that's a big deal. And then eventually, global capitalism, illustrated by the map here, shows you some of the largest companies that advertise and take hold and export and import into certain places around the world. We are connecting ourselves, if for no other causation, through trade and the advent of goods. This is actually your last slide. My apologies for that. This is all the social stuff. So social classes, including the middle class and the industrial working class, developed during the time period. And then with that, you have the changing of the guard when it comes to certain family dynamics. Industrialization mentioned in the last PowerPoint that women and children are heavily utilized in factories and stuff. That's going to change social structure. Gender role sometimes also gets changed. Women, for the most part, undergo a change where they're needed in the factories, right, to do working for a little wage. In some cases, you have examples with, like, for example, Ada Lovelace, where women can rise into prominence and be really influential in new industries. Like, for example, she created an algorithm for computing, so it's kind of like one of the earliest programmers that we have in study. Basically, Ada Lovelace is one of the first programmers ever for computer systems, which is way ahead of computers, so you kind of see what you're doing there with how we change, processing. And then, of course, rapid urbanization accompanies that global capitalism. Those unsanitary conditions need to be addressed as quickly as possible. And once again, you did some of those metaphorical changes when you were playing your urban game. And that is all.